consent, if they're asking you to do it, it's still a crime. An example would be the recent case of David Hunter. You might have read about him in the news. He suffocated his terminally ill wife to death in Cyprus because she had begged him to end her suffering. The next word is euthanasia. Literally means good death. And what happens is that a doctor administers a lethal injection with the intent and effect of killing the patient. It's framed as better than mercy killing because it's more clinical, but it's still an intentional act that kills someone, and at the moment it is still murder or manslaughter. Next up, we have assisted suicide. And this is where the doctor gives the lethal drug to the patient so that the patient can then administer it themselves. So the doctor is not the one performing the actual act. He or she is one step removed, but still very heavily involved. And that's still illegal in this country as well. The Suicide Act 1961 says a person commits an offence if he does an act capable of encouraging or assisting the suicide or attempted suicide of another person. And then assisted dying is the next phrase. It's used by a lot of people campaigning for the law to be changed. And they say it differs from assisted suicide in that it's down to whether you're dying anyway with a terminal illness. So that's what makes it assisted dying. But in law and practice, it's the same as assisted suicide. That's why I haven't put it on the screen. It's the same act. The medic gives the drug to the patient with the intent that the patient will then use it to end. Or definition in law, it's just another form of assisted suicide. And so all of that has been and is illegal in this country. But there are some actions that doctors could take that could on the surface be seen as similar, but are very different from an ethical standpoint. And this is when a doctor withdraws medical treatment and begins palliative care. Says, look, we've done all we can. We're just prolonging life at the moment. We're going to stop doing that. We're going to manage your pain instead. And that is the hardest of decisions, the most personal of decisions, but completely legitimate decision. There's no positive act with the intent of taking a life. And if a doctor does this managing pain relief, he or she will give that pain relief to ease the process of dying, and the drugs you're giving there are not designed to kill, but to reduce pain. The thing is, sometimes they might have the secondary effect of speeding up death, but that's not the intent. And so ethically and morally, that makes the world of difference. So those are the definitions. That's the law as it stands. The top three are all illegal. But there's been a campaign for decades to change the law and basically make assisted suicide legal. The last big push was in 2015. It was defeated in the House of Commons. But we mustn't be complacent. If we look at the shifts in culture, the push towards autonomy and individualism, my right to choose, and the fact that other countries are doing this, so Canada, Australia, USA, New Zealand, we'd be naive to think the pressure isn't going to increase. And so this is an issue that's going to be a massive one in the next few years in cultural debate. So what I want to do next is just outline the arguments in favor of assisted suicide. That's not because I'm in favor of assisted suicide, but I think it's respectful to the other side to be able to understand, well, what is the argument they're making? Why do they think this is such a good thing? So there's three cornerstones to the argument, if you like. Any argument you hear in favor of it will fall under one of these three headings. And the first one is the we need it argument, the compassion argument. We really want to understand the motivations of those campaigning for the law to change. They're not cold-blooded killers who love giving lethal injections or anything like that. What's happening is they're seeing, perhaps experiencing firsthand, the incredible suffering that some people endure. And they rightly want to alleviate that suffering, end that suffering. It's maybe for themselves, maybe for others. They see people who are in terminal decline, and it's only going to get worse. And they think, can we not do something about this? And as you read some of the stories on their websites of men and women declining as they face horrific illnesses, your heart breaks. A lot of their campaigning is based on those powerful emotive stories. So that's the first argument for assisted suicide, is that we need it. Compassion says we need it. Presents it basically as a binary choice between euthanasia and suffering. The second strand of arguments is this: it's that we want it. Basically, it's like an autonomy argument. Why shouldn't we be able to choose when we die? I'm the captain of my ship. I'm the master of my fate. I don't believe in God. Who are you to deny me the right to end my life in the time and manner of my choosing? Sir Patrick Stewart is a patron for the lobby group Dignity in Dying. He said, "We have no control over how we arrive in the world, but at the end of life, we should have control over how we leave it." And a lady who was diagnosed with progressive MS at the age of just 31 said, "I love my life, but I have always been a fiercely independent woman, and I want to have a choice about how and when I die." So that's the second argument. It's that we want it, autonomy. And thirdly, we can control it. This is the public policy argument. Campaigners will say, well, we recognize that if you did this badly, if you did this wrong, this could be really open to abuse. We've heard stories from other nations, but we've got the right set of safeguards. If we do this our way, the law will not be abused or misused. So we need it, we want it, we can control it. And just let's take a moment and just acknowledge the strength of these arguments in today's world. The first one, that the compassion argument, is so powerful because who doesn't want to reduce suffering? And looking someone in the eye who is begging for the law to be changed and saying no is brutal. And if the third argument is true, that we can do it safely, then why shouldn't we allow it? Why should my morality stop others from having what they want? I would say live and let live, but that's not quite right. It would be live and let die. If you don't believe in assisted suicide, then don't have one. Don't stop us from doing it. And as Christians, sometimes we can think, oh, maybe you're right. After all, I don't want to impose my morality. And here's the thing. No, we don't want to impose our morality, but we do want to love our neighbor. So before we just go back and dismantle those three false assumptions in some of those arguments, let's just bring a few biblical principles in to see what God is saying to us on this issue. And principle number one is that life is valuable. As humans, we're made in the image of God. That's the most incredible truth. Genesis 1:27, God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them. We're like him in a way that is true of no other animal. We reflect his glory in a way that not even the stars and the planets are able to. And in Genesis 9, it is because we are made in the image of God that taking a human life becomes such a serious and somber act. It says, whoever sheds human blood, by humans shall their blood be shed. For in the image of God has God made mankind. So that's our first biblical principle. It's life is valuable. And the second one is that it is God who gives and takes life. Psalm 139, such a famous verse. You created my inmost being. You knit me together in my mother's womb. All the days ordained for me were written in your book before one of them came to be. Or we could go to Hannah's song in 1 Samuel chapter 2. The Lord brings death and makes alive. The Lord does it. He brings down to the grave and raises up. There are two instances in the Bible of euthanasia where someone asks someone else to kill them. Neither is portrayed positively. One of them's in the book of Judges, and the general rule of thumb in the book of Judges is if they're doing it in Judges, it's probably a bad idea. But the other one is King Saul. He's mortally wounded. He asks his servant to end his suffering by running him through with a sword, but the servant refuses. Later, however, an Amalekite claims to have done the deed. He recounts, probably untruthfully, but he says, Saul said to me, stand here by me and kill me. I'm in the throes of death, but I'm still alive. So I stood beside him and killed him because I knew that after he had fallen, he could not survive. But the Amalekite, he's not then praised for his mercy and compassion. He's condemned as guilty of murder. The mercy killing was murder. And compare that with Job, who pleads with God to take his life due to his unbearable suffering. He says, oh, that I might have my request, that God would grant what I hope for, that God would be willing to crush me, to let loose his hand and cut off my life. He longs for death, but what he doesn't do is asks one of those friends to do it for him. He sees that it is for God to give and take life. And the third principle that guides our thinking is that we must stand up for the weak and the vulnerable. Evidence from all over the world shows that time and time again, they are the victims when the law on assisted suicide is changed. It is the elderly who are pressured by their families because they don't want to care for them, or because they want their inheritance now and not in 20 years' time. Or it's the elderly who, even though others don't feel this way, they feel that they are being a burden to others and who will choose this option. It is the poor who are told that there isn't funding for treatment for their health condition, but there is funding for assisted suicide if you're interested. It's the disabled who are told their lives are no longer worth protecting, which is why every single disability campaign group is against a change to the law. It's those with mental health struggles who are told their lives are not worth saving or fighting for, but just go ahead and do it. And in some countries, it's children who should not be old enough to consent to a tattoo even. They're led by misguided adults to their own death. In the Netherlands, the minimum age for assisted suicide is 12 months. In Belgium, there is no limit. And Proverbs 31 calls us to speak up for those who cannot speak for themselves, the elderly, the poor, those with mental health struggles, the disabled, the young. Speak up for those who cannot speak for themselves, for the rights of all who are destitute. Speak up and judge fairly. Defend the rights of the poor and needy. And if speaking up is imposing my morality, then of course, guilty as charged. So those are three biblical principles, and it's good that we understand them and we're ready to argue them. But our best approach isn't always to quote Bible verses at people. Sometimes it's great to share the Bible and say, well, actually, God tells us that we're made in the image of God and life is valuable and so on. But sometimes wisdom says that's not always the best approach. It's about knowing your audience, isn't it? And another approach is to go back to those three categories of arguments we looked at for assisted suicide and maybe just unravel them a little bit. Look at where some of the assumptions fall short. So if we went backwards, we could start with the third one, we can control it. And the reality is, no, we can't. In every society where assisted suicide or euthanasia have been legalized, it starts as a very small number of severe cases but the number of people accessing assisted suicide has risen and risen exponentially. And in every society, what starts as very narrow criteria, okay, only if you've got less than 6 months to live, only if you have a terminal illness, it expands and expands and expands. So in Canada, it's no longer about having a terminal illness. Any significant disability or disease, even if not life-threatening. And wherever it's been legalized, the age limit has gone down and down and down. And like I said, in the Netherlands, it's now down to 1. In Belgium, there is no limit. And there's always going to be an expansion of the criteria, because any limits that you impose are by their very nature arbitrary. And I think there's almost an institutional arrogance that says, okay, well, but if we did a suicide, it won't be like that. We'll get better safeguards than the other nations before us. But that's wildly unrealistic. We can't control it. It's like Pandora's box once you open it. The next argument was the we want it argument. We should have the right to choose the time and manner of our own deaths. And that argument is really shallow, because none of us are autonomous islands where the decision is between me and my doctor. The decisions we make, the laws we pass, have ripples across society. That's why in any democracy we accept limits to our freedom. It's what it means to live in society. And so what changes to our culture would assisted suicide bring in? And all these, I promise you, they will sound like scaremongering, but they have all happened, and they've all been documented with stories and statistics in every other country where assisting suicide has been legalized. And if we had more time, what I'd do is I'd slow down and dwell on some of these, but just because we've got a lot to cover, I'm going to go quicker than I want to, but these are the changes that come in when you legalize it. Number one, it changes the relationship between patient and doctor. Fundamentally alters it. Can you have confidence that the decisions they are making, the advice they are giving, are now about preserving my life and are not influenced by cost and economics? There are stories, as I've mentioned already, of people in Canada who are told, we can't afford the drugs that you need, but we can afford to offer you assisted suicide. It changes the way we view mental health and other suicides. In every country where assisted suicide has been legalized, other suicides have also increased. And we generally say as a society, we want to be a society where we reduce the number of people taking their own lives. We commend the brave people who risk everything, trying to save people from harming themselves. I read the story just this week, I think it was, about a police officer who died trying to save the life of someone on some train tracks. And he was commended as a hero as he gave his life trying to save another. But now we're saying, well, we'll save your life in some circumstances, but in other ones we'll pay for you to end it. There's been a wonderful increase in funding and awareness in the last few years for mental health services, because we recognize that people need support in their darkest moments, and this changes that. It changes the way we view people with disabilities. As I've said, almost all disability advocates are against a change in the law, because disability, it becomes a problem to be solved rather than people to be supported. And it changes the way we view the poor. The rich are often the campaigners for assisted suicide, while the poor are the victims. There's a Canadian doctor who's publicly spoken about the 400 people she has killed through euthanasia legally in that country. And regarding one of them, she said she didn't want to die, but she was suffering terribly and maxing out her credit cards. She had no other options. And it sounds brutal when you put it like this, but it's almost a mentality of kill the poor rather than love them. And it shifts an entire society's attitudes, not just the odd doctor. 40% of Canadians under 35 now think poverty and homelessness should be grounds for assisted suicide. And there was a headline in the news last year in The Spectator: "Why is Canada euthanizing the poor?" We haven't even touched on people being pressured into this, sinister motivations, wanting to get inheritance money before it's squandered on care home fees. The "we can control it" argument is naive. The autonomy argument, the "let me have this even if you don't want it," is wishful thinking. And there's also the "we need it" argument, and perhaps this is the one for Christians that resonates the most. That unimaginable suffering, and we should never be blasé in the face of that. But there are other ways of dealing with suffering rather than eliminating the sufferer. And the biggest one is palliative care. Palliative care, as we've said, is where you get to the stage where you're no longer trying to cure an illness, but manage the pain and manage the symptoms. And the UK is the world leader here. We've got the best palliative care of any nation in the world. And again, perhaps time prevents me from telling you the story of Cicely Saunders, a Christian who became the foremost advocate for quality end-of-life care. She's quoted as saying, "You matter because you are you, and you matter to the end of your life. We will do all we can, not only to help you die peacefully, but to live until you die." And that's so beautiful. It's so hopeful in comparison to the message of assisted suicide. There's so much more to be done on palliative care. Provision is patchy. There needs to be more funding. At CARE, we've been doing a lot of campaigning in the House of Lords on access to palliative care. We've introduced legislation and so on. And we're not naive. We don't think that solves every problem and makes every death easy. And sometimes pain can't be managed and suffering is insurmountable, but it's a more holistic and hopeful story than can be offered by the other side. Assisted suicide is presented as neat and clean and easy. It's an attempt to control one of the messiest and most uncontrollable parts of the human story, and it doesn't deliver. Well, I want to leave time for questions. I know time's ticking away. I just want to give a few action points, some positive things that Christians can do. Number one, be clear. That's what this morning was about. Understand the debate. Understand the arguments being used. Be aware when emotional stories are being told to sway our points of view. Number two, be hopeful. There is not an inevitability to this. I found myself agreeing with Humza Yousaf, the Scottish First Minister, this week. It doesn't often happen, but he is against assisted suicide, has come out this week increasingly against it because of the opposition from people with disabilities. There are more and more warning signs from other nations that have done this, so be hopeful. Be praying. At CARE, we produce fantastic prayer resources. One of them is on your seats, 10 ways to pray for the end of life. Do take that and do be praying for this issue. Be informed, sign up to our mailing list, stay up to date, know what's going on with the debate. Be proactive, particularly write to your MP when the time comes. Most MPs are surprisingly open to gracious discussion and debate on this topic. And back in 2015, when it was last in Parliament, a number of MPs changed their minds and voted against assisted suicide simply because of the arguments and speeches they heard in the House of Commons. And finally, be loving. As Christians, we're for people, not just positions or policies or parties. And at the heart of this debate are people who are suffering, who are lonely, who are isolated, in need of support, in need of help. So be there for the lonely people on your streets and in your family. We say people are made in the image of God. Show that in the way you love people and invest in them. Right. I've got a quote. I'm going to leave that. Let's just come on to any questions. I'd love to take any questions you might have. We've got 2 minutes. Anyone got any questions about assisted suicide? Yes.
Are there other countries that also won't allow assisted suicide? Because you said quite a lot of ones that will allow it.
Yeah, so the default, it's almost like the default in every nation until recently has been not to allow it. And then there's a small number of countries, but quite influential and powerful ones, who are starting to allow it. So most countries still don't. But I think think it's about 15 countries globally now do. So most countries don't, but the ones that do are the cultural leaders. USA, Canada. It's not, like a random country. Well, there is Ecuador, but it's not like a random country in South America or something. So most countries still don't. Yeah.
And do those most recent countries make distinctions between suicide and euthanasia? They still try and make the point that they decide that euthanasia is illegal.
It varies. So Canada have got a program they call MAID, M-A-I-D, Medical Assistance in Dying, and that is both assisted dying and euthanasia are permitted under that law. Other countries do just say only assisted dying. The campaign in the UK is currently just for assisted dying, assisted suicide, but it's one of the things that gets expanded over time. Yeah.
And I think it came up when I was first stayed there for a while, working service in the training, both training I went to renew your what would you do if people who maybe got a crash helmet that says do not resuscitate or this is one that says do not resuscitate? You're the first person there, the only person you can, and you know you're not a doctor or anything like that, but you must do something to save them.
Yeah.
And all of us pretty well said, do what you can do, and the professional would have to sort out what you feel about this.
I mean, it's incredibly difficult, isn't it? And you get some, high pressure situations like you're describing there when there's an accident happen, says do not resuscitate. And there is often a lot of gray. It's not all, there is a gray middle. It's not always black and white. But I think what I'd say is there is a distinction between whether you say, I'm not going to resuscitate. That is one thing, which it might be the right choice in certain circumstances. It's very different to say, I am actively going to kill. I'm actively going to, even with consent, I'm actively going to take a life. So not resuscitating is very different from saying, I'm going to give you a drug that then takes your life, if that makes sense. But it can be so complicated, and every situation needs to be taken on that case by case level. Yeah. Yeah, go on. Last question. Yeah, so just in case you didn't hear that, just the story of your niece who is a physio, was given the opportunity to train as a doctor, but didn't because she's worried about the medical ethics and the direction of the profession. And I think, again, that's a really individual choice. We need good Christians who are standing up, and we need people to say, well, I'm going to go in and I'm going to be different, or I'm going to be salt and light. And many doctors who aren't Christians are also against this. But for some people, actually, it is the right call to say, actually, I need to stay away from that because it's complex. And again, that's a really personal decision. Hey, thanks everyone for coming, for listening, and for your questions. I'm around. Do come and chat to me more if you've got any more questions. And again, just encourage you, do sign up and do connect with us on any of our social media things as well. But that's enough for today. Let me pray. Father God, thank you that you value life. Thank you that you care for us, you give and take life. Help us to be those who love those who are alive and seek to care for them and care for them well. Amen.